Hi, I'm Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect Magazine, and you're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of Media Confidential with myself and Lionel Barber, in which we speak to a special guest. If you want to watch the full episode, please click on the link below, and if you want to subscribe to Prospect Magazine, please visit our website at www.prospectmagazine.co.uk. Enjoy. We're really pleased now to be joined by Professor Tim Snyder. 7 years ago, Tim, you wrote a book called On Tyranny, and you followed that up now this week with a book called On Freedom. What are you trying to do with this book?
It's very simple. I'm trying to say what freedom is and what it would mean in politics. I've got this idea that freedom, the term, makes us angry, and freedom, the concept, we've made very vague to the point of not really having any meaning. Whereas I think, at least in our world, in the American world, maybe in the English-speaking world, it's the only possible uniting political concept. So I'm trying to define what it is. And what I think it is the value of values. I think it's the thing which enables us, it's the state which enables us to combine, realize the things that we think are important. And so in that way, I think freedom is positive.
And because this is a media podcast, how important is media freedom and press freedom and the freedom of thought and speech to the overall concept of freedom?
Let me start with freedom of thought, because I think it's a good way to introduce what I mean by freedom being positive. I think we tend to think of freedom of thought as the freedom to think the things we're thinking right now. But I think much more broadly, freedom of thought would have to involve creating the conditions in which as many of us, or as many of our fellow citizens, as many people in general, would be able to think on their own. So if we think freedom of thought just means right now there's no barrier to you thinking what you want, that's very fine. But I don't think it actually gets us very far. If we want to have a free society, we have to have a society of free thinkers, which means imagining the conditions that children would need to grow up to become that way, and regarding the policies that would make them that way as elemental to freedom. So freedom isn't just the government not being in the way. Freedom is the government enabling people to become free thinkers. And I think the same thing applies to freedom of speech. I think we get lost here a bit by thinking of free speech, because if we think of free speech, then we were thinking of the utterance and not the person. And of course, at this point in the third decade in the 21st century, most utterances are not actually connected to people. Almost none of them are. The significance of freedom of speech is that it allows humans to speak truth to power. And when we think of freedom, if we think of free speech instead, what we find ourselves doing is defending the algorithmic utterances of billionaires and heads of state, rather than defending the right of actual humans to say things that would challenge the billionaires and the heads of state. So again, it's very good not to violate the right of people to speak, but more significant and more essential is to think of the conditions in which we can have as many free speakers as possible. And then likewise with media. I don't want anyone to be blocking your podcast or getting in the way of anybody else's. But just as essential is to think of the conditions in which we would have lots and lots of reporting, the conditions in which the regulatory setup, in which the financial setup, in which it would make sense for there to be much fact creation on the ground. So in all of these ways, freedom of media, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, absolutely essential. But if we rethink freedom as positive, I think we end up with a much more grounded, defensible, and functional notion of these things.
I'm minded to quote Thomas Jefferson, and maybe his spirit infuses your new book. He famously said, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." And we as journalists, Alan was an editor for many years as I was, we think of the role of the media as being one of those people or one of the institutions that pursues eternal vigilance. Is that correct?
I'm going to agree with the premise. I've got to struggle a little bit with the setup, because I don't think Jefferson actually ever said that. I think he said things like that, but I don't think he said that. I think the person who said that was actually a couple of decades later. And it was an abolitionist. But yes, of course. And at the most basic level, right? So I'm in a country right now where the biggest news story right now is a complete fiction about people in my home state who supposedly eat domestic animals. And that is dominating the news. That is the central plank right now of the Trump-Vance campaign. And of course, this is only possible in a world of not just an absence of vigilance, but a presence of spectacle, where media becomes nothing more but a vector for the fantasies of the powerful. But Springfield, Ohio in general, where I grew up and where this fantasy is set, used to have lots and lots of local newspapers. A story like this would have been killed, laughed out of town, mocked 30 or 40 years ago because there would have been a bunch of local reporters writing about it. But now a single person is able to take a fantasy and run with it. So anyway, but affirming your premise more positively, the things that people really need to know about their lives are things like, is the local town council corrupt? Is there mercury or lead in the water? Is there corruption on the school board? These are the things we really need to know. And without local journalism, without that level of vigilance, people don't know those things. And then I believe there's a carry-on effect where once people lose local journalism, then they lose the idea that there are reporters who report things that are true, and they simply follow things at a national, international, or conspiratorial level, which happen to match their own predilections. So yes, vigilance for all kinds of reasons.
How do you think the media, the national media, we'll come to local in a minute, can in effect take an active role, not a passive role, but an active role in defending democracy? I
mean, it's pretty important to me that we don't have to reach that heroic moment, like so from Russia, like I know
which
very
you
well,
obviously specialized in. You've written books.
Yeah. And some of my friends and the people I admire the most are journalists who have been in that heroic moment and then gone through that heroic moment and are out the other end, And so I just want to note that we don't want to be in a position where we're a few beleaguered journalists, right? We want to have the government supported by our fellow citizens, creating the conditions so that we never have to get there. But I understand what you mean by the question. I just wanted to note that.
This is true. But
yeah.
just to come in, I mean, the Washington Post adopted a slogan: "Democracy dies in darkness." I mean, they almost were. Maybe they were overpromising.
And then later they put that slogan itself in darkness, which was a little discouraging.
Please carry on.
I think it's absolutely right. I think it's true that democracy dies in darkness for the reasons that that apply to your question about vigilance as well. Namely, that democracy isn't a big thing. It's not a yes or no. It's not a black or white. Democracy is the habit of contesting things, which begins locally, contesting things on the basis of different values, but presumably identical and verifiable facts. And reporters come in not because they say democracy, hooray. Reporters come in because they supply the facts, which allow people with different values to carry out those debates and those electoral campaigns in which there's both contact and friction. Without the facts, we're left alone with our different values, and our different values become, without contact with other people, without contact with facts, our different values start to rot. They start to ferment. They start to turn us into the kinds of people we weren't before, people who are not capable of democracy.
So let me just follow up one more time on this. You have talked and written eloquently about what you describe as a post-truth age. Can you explain what you mean by that?
There's a view with which I disagree, which says that liberation from the idea of truth would also mean political liberation. That is a certain, essentially French interpretation of the age of totalitarianism, which I think has gained a lot of traction and which I think is essentially wrong. I think what has happened is that if you believe that uprooting us from notions of truth makes us free because it allows us to represent ourselves authentically in terms of our feelings and so on, what happens with that on a large scale is that the people who are very wealthy and who control the platforms and are good at managing spectacle turn out to be much better at projecting their feelings. One sees this in UK politics. One certainly sees it in American politics. where, if feeling is first, if that's what matters, if we're in a post-truth world, then a character like Donald Trump has a tremendous advantage. So what I said in On Tyranny was that post-truth is pre-fascism. And I believe that. I think a misguided attempt to liberate people by freeing them from notions of truth gives a tremendous advantage to the people who are good at lying, willing to lie, and can back their lies with a lot of power.
Yeah, I'm very glad you fact-checked my colleague on his erroneous information about Jefferson.
I blame Google and the fact that I last read my biographies of Jefferson some 20 years ago. But that's just me making an excuse.
You'd never take that from one of your reporters, but I got it from Google. So anyway, passing on rapidly.
I'm going to be double, triple, and quadruple fact checked.
Yeah, I'm already doing that, Tim.
Lionel, so.
Don't worry, we'll check you again. Is the battle lost? I mean, we're familiar with the Steve Bannon phrase, flooding the zone with shit, and the sheer quantity and scale of misinformation coincides with an industry and journalism in crisis. How can one ever regain the thing that you're talking about, the centrality of agreed fact?
I mean, I guess my starting premise is that we really, really have to try, because there isn't another way. I mean, the media of the 2030s isn't going to look like the media of the 1980s, but it must look different than the media of the 2020s if we're going to get through this as societies where people can be free or where their votes matter. And from there, I try to think more or less big. I mean, I think that the book, which we all take for granted, is a result of regulation. It's a result of consensual norms. It's a result of things like copyright. And the book, the printing press before it became the book caused a huge ruckus. A third of the European population died. Social media, I think similarly, it can be regulated. There's no reason to treat it like nature, which is what some of the American Silicon Valley oligarchs and libertarians want us to think. But it's not nature. It can be regulated like any other medium can be regulated. And I believe it has to be. Not just in the sense of controlled, but I think the vast profits it creates have to be siphoned back into journalism, just like you would, for example, tax people who emit carbon dioxide and siphon some of those profits back into, let's say, solar panels or carbon capture. When something's causing a tremendous evil, it's reasonable to tax it and then to try to support the things which do the opposite. And then we can't drop the ideal. Because when we drop the ideal of, whether it's vigilance or whether it's fact creation or whether it's truth, when we drop the ideal, then we're basically creating this flat, smooth slide for the other side. So I think I agree, we're in a really tough position, but I don't think it's hopeless, because the power of government is still quite significant and governments can be moved by ideas.
Your book echoes the famous book On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, and every politics student can quote his dictums about the best correction for untruths is the best correction of speech is more speech. And you feel that's very much when I watch Elon Musk's behavior on Twitter. He essentially seems to think as a sort of extreme libertarian. Anybody can say anything, and somehow the truth will emerge from that on the sort of Mill principle. Can you say why Mill no longer works in 2024?
Honestly, I don't think it ever worked. I mean, I love John Stuart Mill. I loved him as a kid. That was my favorite book as a teenager. But I don't think it was true in Mill's time either, honestly. I think it can be true in a milieu like Mill's, or it can be true for moments, but I don't in general ever think it was true. And I think that particular Anglo-Saxon tradition leads us astray. And if I can make a sort of dialectical remark, the fact that everyone tends to believe that is a sign that it isn't true, if you know what I mean. Like like that view about the free market of ideas has risen to the top, but it's not true, which shows that, not true ideas rise to the top. I think we have to start from the other end, that there is no particular human propensity for truth. We have to assign a value to truth. Truth is difficult. It's pretty unlikely that truth is going to rise to the surface. It's never going to rise to the surface without some kind of organized effort, or what Václav Havel called a collective labor. it's going to take labor. We're going to have to do it together. Like we want to imagine that like the truth has this heroic quality about it and it will against all odds make it. But I just don't think that's ever true. But I take your point that the situation is much worse in 2024, thanks to social media, and in particular, thanks to Twitter, than it was in, say, 1984, because it's not just the human preference for conformity or comfort that we're dealing with now. We're also dealing with algorithms which are aimed at our human preference for comfort, conformity, sometimes conflict. And those algorithms basically are designed to make us worse. They're designed to make us less million than we were before. And they have done so with great success. And so one has to look at those algorithms and say, well, that's not a natural part of the world. That's making us stupider than it was before. It's making us much more governable by authoritarian regimes and much less capable of democracy.
Well, Media Confidential deals with the facts. And as you've been speaking, I've done some serious research, including on Monticello.org. And while it is true that the abolitionist you were referring to, Frederick Douglass, did say this, so did two ex-presidents. It was well known in the 19th century, James Buchanan, widely known or often described as the worst president in history. Maybe one or two recently might vie for that title. Also William Henry Harrison. But actually, although it is ascribed to Jefferson, it's John Philpott Curran in 1790 who is most likely identified. So anyway, we have plurality here. This is really good. I want to ask you finally about disinformation, because that is also an enemy of freedom. You are an expert on Russia, written widely on the subject. Do you think that the level of and sophistication of disinformation has grown exponentially in the last 5 years, 7 years?
Yeah. I mean, I wrote a book called Road to Unfreedom about the 2010s, in which this was a central theme. I was trying to track there the so to speak neutral capacity of the social media for this kind of thing, and how it creates an attack surface for people who are not just after profit, but also after disruption or after supporting a particular candidate, which is what happened to the US in the 2016 election. It's also what happened to the United Kingdom in the run-up to the referendum on Brexit. In fact, the very same actors, the very same Russian actors, and even the very same Russian bots were active for Trump and for Brexit.
The same troll farms, are you saying?
But also quite literally sometimes the same bots, the same digital creations were shifted from one to the other. And in both cases, it was, I mean, nobody likes to think this, but in both cases, it was probably decisive. And so, so we're already in a world where digital activity can affect the real world quite profoundly, because a UK without Brexit or an America without a first Trump term would be very different countries indeed. But yet, to answer your question, yes, clearly, social media makes this so much easier. And of course, it's the hostile actors, foreign but also domestic, who are best at using this, and then it puts everybody else on the defensive. And we tend only to recognize what's happened after the fact, or in the case of the UK, to recognize what's happened, but try to bury it as deep as possible. In the US, the Obama administration recognized it, but wrote about it after November in a very obscure way, leaving it to a few writers, a few social scientists, historians, and journalists to try to make us pay attention. But yeah, I think it's worse now. And I think domestic actors have, in a way, copied the foreign actors. I think the Trump-Vance campaign has basically Russified itself in the sense that it's only about combative, disruptive messages which have nothing to do with reality. They've liberated them in the sense of negative freedom now. Like, they've liberated themselves completely from all restraint.
One last question for you, Tim. The election is currently 50-50. How much should we be worried by a second Trump term for the kind of things that you're writing about for freedom?
Well, the first Trump term was much worse than most people remember, which is a funny thing. And the second Trump term would be worse for, I think, three basic reasons. The first is that the first time around, it was basically a stunt. And he was then, trying to make money out of it. And of course, he wanted to stay in power. But the second time around, it's much clearer that if he doesn't win, he's going to go to prison, or at least he's going to be sentenced to, he's going to have some kind of sentence that he'll have to actually fulfill. And that puts him in this kind of incredibly banal 21st century category, along with Netanyahu, along with Putin, along with these people who know that they're criminals in any normal sense, and who very selfishly, therefore, want to die in beds, and they want to die in beds that are inside, in this case, the White House. And so Trump has always had the motivation of like trying to make money, finally become rich, which he's always wanted to be, finally become rich and stay out of prison. But now the staying out of prison part is much sharper than it was in 2016 or 2020. So he really wants to be in the White House, and then he's going to want to stay there till he dies, i.e., have multiple terms, as many terms as necessary. The second thing, which is different, is the sense of grievance. He knows he lost, but one of his many talents, and he is talented. One of his many talents is that he's capable of knowing that he lost and still being angry at the rest of us for saying so. And so there's this enormous sense of grievance and these promises that he's going to lock up people who are having the kind of conversation that we're having right now about, the basic facts about what happened in 2020, which is that he lost a presidential election. And he's named names too. Of all the people he's going to track down. The third thing, and maybe the most important thing, though, is that he now has the cadres. In 2016, he didn't. By the end of 2020, he was getting to the point where he had the people who are willing to take apart the federal government. Now he's got long lists of those people, and they're ready to fire thousands, in fact, tens of thousands of American civil servants and replace them with people who won't know how to do those jobs, but who will help to take the American federal government apart. And that injects, so in addition to the bad faith and the grievance and the desire to stay in power forever, that injects a huge chaos factor, because even if these people don't succeed in doing the various things they want to do in power, they're going to make the federal government stop working because they don't know how to do anything. And that itself, I think, is going to favor strongman rule, because when normal institutions don't work, people start to, this is a banal thing, but when normal institutions don't work, then people have to rely on their cousin who used to date, Trump's son or something like that. That will be the only way to get anything done. So those are the reasons why I think it's going to be worse.
I wish we could end on a more positive note, but I could thoroughly recommend the book On Freedom by Tim Snyder, out today. And thank you so much, Tim, for coming along to talk to us on Media Confidential.
Thanks for reaching out. I'm really glad we could have the conversation.